Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Looking forward to getting into this today.
Okay, so, you know how for ages it felt like pretty much everything you picked up said made in China?
Oh yeah, definitely. The world's factory, right?
Exactly. Well, for this deep dive, we're looking at whether that's still, the whole story.
Right. Is it changing?
Seems like it might be. We've got a bunch of info here on how global supply chains are shifting, what's up with the U.S.-China trade stuff.
The tariff war roller coaster.
Totally. And some interesting things apparently bubbling up inside China, this blank paper movement idea.
Plus some pretty serious warnings coming out of the U.S. about Taiwan.
Yeah, and that leads to this real head-scratcher. China saying Taiwan's the one causing trouble while they seem to be getting ready for maybe more than just talks.
Exactly. It's like a puzzle with a lot of moving pieces. So our job today is to kind of sort them out, see what the bigger picture looks like for you.
Let's try and give you the key takeaways without getting totally lost.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's kick things off with this idea then. China maybe not being the world's factory anymore. What's actually shifting?
Well, the sources we've looked at talk about moving away from relying so heavily on just one place. It's becoming more like a mosaic-type supply chain.
A mosaic, like different pieces fitting together.
Exactly. Think of it like building something with different colored tiles. Each tile, or in this case, each country plays its own specific role.
Okay, so instead of one giant workshop, it's more like smaller, specialized ones popping up across Asia. Who's doing what?
Right. So, for instance, the Philippines, they've got a young workforce, lots of English speakers.
Good for call centers and stuff, BPO.
Yeah, business process outsourcing, exactly. And even some R&D now. Then you've got Thailand, which already had a decent auto industry.
And they're moving into EVs.
Right, aiming to be a big electric vehicle hub. And Malaysia, they're really strong in this sort of high-tech, back-end, precision processing, especially semiconductors.
Semiconductors.
Yeah.
The chips and everything. So some pretty sophisticated stuff, too, not just basic assembly.
Definitely.
What about, the large-scale stuff? Clothes, basic goods.
That's where countries like Bangladesh come in.
Yeah.
They're really competitive for low-cost mass production, especially garments.
Okay.
And Indonesia, they've got huge reserves of nickel, which you need for EV batteries. Plus massive population, so a big domestic market, too.
Makes sense. And Vietnam, I hear about them a lot.
Vietnam's growing super fast in electronics production, lower labor costs compared to China, and they've been improving their infrastructure, roads, ports.
It sounds like a real mix and match then. But one country keeps coming up as kind of central to this new mosaic. India. Why them?
A couple of big reasons, really. First, just the sheer size of their population. That's a huge potential market for companies and a massive potential workforce.
Right, numbers matter.
And apparently, a 2022 survey ranked India as the most important future location for production. That's pretty significant.
Wow, okay. But I feel like I remember hearing India had challenges. Infrastructure, maybe.
That's definitely been true. Things like reliable power, transportation.
Yeah.
They've been hurdles. Bureaucracy, too, and finding enough skilled workers.
So what's changing?
Well, the Indian government seems serious now. They're pouring money into building better railways, highways, ports, even waterways.
Trying to build that foundation.
Exactly. And they've got this thing called the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI. Basically, financial rewards for companies that manufacture more in specific sectors.
So they're trying to attract the big names? Is it working?
We're seeing signs. Big players like Boeing, Taiwanese electronics firms like Wistron and Pegatron, they're expanding operations there.
Okay, so India's definitely making moves. But it sounds like maybe they won't just replicate China entirely, take over everything?
Probably not. They still have those hurdles. The infrastructure, the skills gap. So it's unlikely they become the single dominant world factory like China was.
More like a key piece of this new spread out system.
Exactly. Different countries using their specific strengths. And it's interesting, this shift seems to dovetail with some U.S. policies targeting China.
Like what?
Like restricting how Chinese AI models get trained, or the bans on Huawei chips. The sources suggest these more targeted things might be more effective than just broad tariffs.
Okay, so a more diverse manufacturing world. Got it. Now let's talk about that trade back and forth. The U.S. and China tariffs. Feels like forever. What's the latest there? A truce?
Yeah, truce or pause is how it's being described. There was this temporary agreement. The U.S. lowered tariffs on some Chinese goods.
Lowered them from what?
They were ranging from like 14.5% up to 30% on various things, and they came down. And China, in return, reduced some of their retaliatory tariffs on U.S. stuff down to about 10%.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, there's this 90-day window for more negotiations, and they lifted some restrictions on China exporting rare earth minerals to the U.S.
Okay. Sounds like a bit of a breather, maybe. Is everyone celebrating?
Not quite. You've got the White House calling it a historic win, and Chinese state media saying the U.S. blinked.
Naturally.
But then you have experts, analysts, who are much more cautious. They're saying, look, this might just be temporary, maybe just hitting reset on the talks.
Any idea why now?
Some speculation it might be linked to domestic political pressure in the U.S. You know how that goes.
Yeah, always factor. But even with this pause, are there still underlying issues, problems just simmering?
Oh, absolutely. Experts are pointing to ongoing risks. For one, it's still not exactly easy for foreign companies to operate completely freely in China. There's this talk of a nationalistic landscape.
Meaning they favor their own?
Pretty much. And then there's the whole fentanyl issue. That's a huge, huge point of friction, and China denies responsibility.
Right, that's not going away.
Plus, all those non-tariff barriers are still there. Unclear rules for licenses, favoring Chinese tech, import restrictions. These deeper issues aren't solved by just tweaking tariffs for 90 days.
So even if tariffs are lower for a bit, China still has other ways to make things tricky for foreign firms.
Exactly. And there are reports suggesting Beijing's longer-term play might be this internal circulation strategy.
Meaning?
Focusing on growing their own domestic economy, reducing reliance on the U.S. even while they're at the negotiating table.
Hedging their bets?
Kind of. Some analysts are even telling U.S. companies maybe use these 90 days as a serious relocation window.
Wow, okay, so not exactly a sign of lasting peace.
Doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
And apparently this truce came after some secret high-level talks. Beijing has also quietly made a few concessions, like removing retaliatory tariffs on certain U.S.-made chips.
Interesting. A bit of give and take behind the scenes. But the U.S. must have things they really want, right? Their bottom lines.
Yeah, reports say the U.S. laid down 3 tough red lines for the ongoing talks. 1, real structural reforms of the Chinese economy. 2, reciprocal market access, meaning let our companies operate in China as easily as Chinese companies operate here. And 3, combating illicit trade, especially fentanyl.
Those sound like major hurdles. Going to be tough to make progress in just 90 days.
Very tough.
Okay, switching gears a bit, let's talk about what's going on inside China. Signs of potential discontent. This blank paper thing sounds odd.
Yeah, this touches on internal dissent and how sensitive the CCP seems to be about any hint of protest. There's an article we saw by a Peking University professor, Zhang Ningjing.
Okay.
And she's pretty critical of the current Xi Jinping era. She questions the official GDP growth numbers, talks about widespread disappointment, maybe even a structural recession.
So someone on the inside questioning the narrative, what's her solution?
She talks about needing political reform from within, but, and this is a big but, she also says real freedom is basically impossible under single-party rule, and past reforms haven't really worked out.
Sounds pretty bleak.
Her argument is that in these top-down patriarchal systems, reforms initiated from the top just tend to collapse, and any genuine reform from below gets stifled.
So she doesn't see a way forward from within the system.
Pretty much. She warns about societal decay, rising public anger, more violence. She calls the CCP hypocritical and their propaganda ineffective. She even suggests advanced AI can't save the system. Change has to come from outside, she thinks.
Wow, that's quite a statement from a Peking University professor. And this connects to the blank paper thing.
Directly. The CCP seems deeply afraid of dissent. And these incidents with blank A4 paper look like paranoia linked to the 2022 protests where people held up blank white sheets.
What kind of incidents?
Well, there were reports from Zhejiang province of police stopping a car just because it had a blank A4 sheet on the windshield.
Seriously, just a piece of paper.
Apparently. And in Inner Mongolia, a shop owner reportedly got fined for posting a job ad on A4 paper.
A job ad? Fined.
Yeah. The official cited a supposed national ban on using A4 paper like that issued by the state council.
That sounds almost unbelievable. Is it even real?
People online have been mocking it relentlessly. But whether the ban is real or just an excuse, it highlights this intense fear and lack of freedom. The takeaway seems to be the CCP is terrified of sparking another white paper movement.
Where even silence, a blank sheet, is seen as a protest.
Exactly. The symbol itself has become threatening to them.
Okay, that's unsettling. All right, from internal fears to external risks, let's move to Taiwan. We saw info about U.S. congressional hearings focused on preventing Chinese aggression there. What was the main message?
The absolute main takeaway was urgency. The threat isn't seen as distant anymore. It's viewed as potentially imminent.
Imminent. How soon?
They keep referencing the 2027 Davidson window. That's now understood as the deadline Xi Jinping has supposedly given the PLA, the Chinese military, to be ready to take Taiwan by force.
Ready by 2027.
And this is happening alongside a massive Chinese military buildup. Land, sea, air, space, cyber, across the board.
Yeah.
There's a real feeling in Congress that this current term might be the last chance to really change Beijing's calculations.
A closing window. So why is preventing this seen as so critical for the U.S.?
They laid out a few key reasons. First, values. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy, a stark contrast to what they explicitly called China's one-party dictatorship. They drew that parallel to government of the people, by the people, for the people.
And economically.
Hugely important. Taiwan's crucial for U.S. prosperity. They're our 7th largest trading partner, a big market for U.S. exports like corn and soybeans, and Taiwanese investment in the U.S. is surging. Think of that huge TSMC semiconductor plant being built.
Right, TSMC, the chip giant. So it's not just abstract principles. What happens if conflict does break out?
The potential impact described is devastating, globally. They talked about a possible 10% drop in global GDP in a single year.
10%, that's huge.
Worse than the peak of the COVID pandemic fallout, and specifically losing Taiwan semiconductors. The estimate was it could trigger an immediate Great Depression.
An immediate Great Depression, because TSMC makes almost all the advanced chips.
The vast majority, yeah. Chips essential for everything from phones and cars to advanced military tech. Losing that supply would be catastrophic.
That really paints a scary picture. Okay, so the focus is entirely on stopping it from happening. Deterrence. How?
Exactly. Deterrence is the goal. Making Beijing believe the costs of aggression are just unbearable.
And how do you do that?
It's a mix. Military posture, capability, clear messaging, and demonstrating political will. It requires serious, visible, and swift actions to change Beijing's risk assessment.
So not just words, what specific actions were discussed?
A lot, actually. Integrating U.S. ground forces more closely with allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, India, Indonesia, building up an Indo-Pacific land power network.
Okay, strengthening alliances.
Investing in specific U.S. Army capabilities, like mobile long-range missile systems, they mentioned Typhoon and HIMARS, these multi-domain task forces, and ensuring sustained logistics, basically having the right stuff in the right place.
What else? Deeper engagement with allies.
Absolutely, including European nations, too. Strengthening U.S. shipbuilding, boosting production of critical munitions, ideally with allied cooperation.
Munitions are key, I guess.
Definitely. Also, protecting U.S. critical infrastructure from Chinese cyber activities, making U.S. society more resilient against malicious influence, like the concerns around ByteDance TikTok.
Right, the influence campaigns.
Investing in missile defense, especially against hypersonic missiles, and even creating a standalone U.S. cyber force.
A whole new military branch for cyber.
That was one suggestion, yeah. Shows how serious that domain is seen.
And what about Taiwan's role in its own defense? What do they need to do?
That's crucial. Taiwan needs to adequately resource its own military. The recommendation was boosting defense spending to 3% of GDP this year, aiming for 5% by 2028.
Where should that money go?
Focused on anti-invasion ground forces, air and naval capabilities needed to repel an attack, and investing in what's called asymmetric defense.
Asymmetric, meaning?
Things that are harder for a larger force to target: mobile systems, survivable systems, making themselves a tougher nut to crack.
A porcupine strategy, I've heard it called.
Something like that. Plus, deepening civil-military integration, reforming the reserve system, homeland defense strategies, lots of training. A resilient society makes a quick, clean PLA victory much less likely, which helps deterrence.
Makes sense. Make it look like a long, bloody mess. And the U.S.-Taiwan relationship itself?
Needs strengthening. The U.S. needs to be a better, more effective partner. That means fixing delays in arms sales.
Yeah, I've heard about those backlogs.
Maximizing military aid through programs like foreign military financing, presidential drawdown authority, this new Taiwan Security Assistance Initiative, maybe even pre-positioning munitions in Taiwan.
Storing weapons there beforehand.
It's being considered. And expanding joint training and exercises.
It sounds like a comprehensive approach. Were there any challenges mentioned aside from the urgency?
Yeah, a couple. One was a lack of awareness among the U.S. public about Taiwan and why it matters. Another was internal U.S. debates about strategic interests. and this concept of spheres of influence.
Arguing we shouldn't meddle.
Some argue that, yeah. But the counterargument was that accepting spheres of influence goes against U.S. interests and historical responsibilities.
So what was the final call to action?
Commending the bipartisan cooperation on the issue so far, emphasizing that peace across the strait has largely been due to legislative action, starting with the Taiwan Relations Act back in '79. That leadership needs to continue.
And the bottom line?
There's still time to deter war, but time is not on our side. Deterrence requires focus, especially on land power integrated with allies, all synchronized. Congress needs to clearly state U.S. interests lie in strongly supporting Taiwan. Heavy stuff indeed. Okay, this leads perfectly into our last point, this bizarre contradiction. China saying Taiwan is disrupting peace, while, according to these hearings, she has ordered the PLA to be ready for invasion by 2027. How do they justify that?
Right, it's a narrative challenge, let's say. China's stated reasons basically boil down to a few things.
Okay, like what?
They claim Taiwan's ruling party, the DPP, pushes independence and rejects the One China principle. They point to Taiwan seeking international support, especially military cooperation with the U.S., as provocative.
So Taiwan wanting friends is provocative.
In their view, yes, if it seems aimed at securing independence. They also say Taiwan won't talk under the One China framework, and they argue force might be needed to prevent legal independence. Foreign military support, they claim, encourages this, hence their own military drills as deterrent.
Okay, so that's their official line, but the contradictions seem glaring.
Absolutely. The most obvious is saying you want peaceful reunification while actively preparing for war and running exercises that destabilize the region. It just doesn't track. Actions speak louder.
And their definition of peace is basically Taiwan accepts our control. It ignores any desire Taiwan might have for self-determination or just maintaining the current status quo.
Peace on their terms only.
Exactly. There's also a suspicion they might be using Taiwan as a scapegoat to deflect from internal issues or justify their own military expansion. And that line between preventing independence with force and just plain aggression gets incredibly blurry with that 2027 readiness deadline.
It feels like they're setting the stage, creating a pretext.
It certainly raises that concern. There's a fundamental clash in definitions. Internationally, peace usually means not using force, resolving disputes democratically. China's version seems closer to unity under our rule, no dissent.
Does international law say anything here?
Well, the UN Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. While Taiwan's status is complex, China's actions towards this de facto independent entity seem to run counter to that principle.
So it looks like narrative warfare, trying to control the story.
That seems to be a big part of it. Painting themselves as peacekeepers while preparing for conflict. The inconsistencies are pretty stark. Accusing Taiwan of disrupting peace when Taiwan hasn't initiated hostilities, calling seeking foreign support collusion, setting preconditions for dialogue that kill real discussion.
It doesn't sound like a genuine effort for peace through mutual agreement.
No. Defining peace as simply accepting the ruler's unilaterally imposed order. That's more about power politics, about hegemony, than actual peace.
Okay, wow. That is a lot to process. So let's try and sum this up. We're seeing manufacturing globalize, diversifying away from just China.
Right, this mosaic supply chain.
The U.S.-China tariff war is in this kind of uneasy pause. Lots of underlying issues remain.
A fragile truce, maybe?
There's some internal anxiety bubbling up within China, shown by things like the blank paper paranoia.
Reflecting CCP fears, it seems.
The U.S. is sounding increasingly urgent warnings about a potential Chinese move on Taiwan by 2027, pushing hard for deterrence.
Seeing the window is closed.
And China is engaging in this contradictory rhetoric, claiming Taiwan disrupts peace while actively preparing military options.
Yeah, a real disconnect between words and actions, and a very different definition of peace.
That really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What does genuine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait actually entail? And whose definition should ultimately prevail?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some serious food for thought there.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that's all the deep diving we have time for today. Hope you found that useful.
Yeah, definitely a complex picture.
If you did find it interesting, please make sure you hit that subscribe button for the Sip and Talk podcast. Keep up with our dives.
We appreciate you tuning in.
And hey, while you're at it, why not pop over and check out our good buddy Mickey's YouTube channel? Give him some love. You know you want to.
Always good stuff over there. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next time.